Winter waits for no one here in the northern states. That's why when fall comes, we get going on altering what we need to in the way of outerwear. Here's a beautiful cashmere coat that's too wide for the client, so we're going to slim it up for her. I'll show you how. We will make this coat more form-fitting by taking in these two back seams. By standing in front of the mirror, the client and I figured out how much we wanted to take out on each side, making a more flattering fit against the torso. Underneath, at the shoulder blade, we start out at virtually nothing, increase to about an inch, and then come back out to the original seam, right at probably her hip level, until we have a nice new form-fitting coat. With chalk, I've drawn a line from pin to pin on the left side until I've drawn a nice curved wedge shape. And yes, this is on the outside of the coat. That's because we pinned through all thicknesses the lining and the outside of the coat with the garment on the client while she stood in front of the mirror, and we pinned out the excess. And now I'll do the same thing on the other side, is make a matching chalk line. Make certain each side is quite uniform. Solidify your lines. And don't worry about drawing on the outside of the coat. This is all going to disappear. Now copy this chalk line onto the lining underneath. How? Feel underneath. Make sure the seam from the lining can be felt underneath the seam of the cashmere coat. Place a pin in the seam just to keep it stable. And now place a few pins along the chalk line that you've drawn on the one side of the seam. Flip the coat over and see how the pins show through the lining, and you can now trace from pin to pin just like you did on the top side of the coat, like so. Take a ruler if you're more comfortable doing it that way, and go from pin to pin, making your marks. There's an alternative to drawing on the outside of the coat, just in case that made you nervous to draw on the outside of the coat. We can do it a different way. I'll demonstrate on the other seam. Flip the coat over to the lining side. Remember how you've pinned through all thicknesses when you had the client in the coat in front of the mirror. Where the pins meet, make a mark. You can feel for the pins and then make your mark. If your chalk is really cooperative, you can make a mark on both sides.
Finding value so far, please give us a like, share it, and we'd just love to have you subscribe.
Here I can feel another pin right here. Make a mark. I can see and feel a pin right here. Make a mark. Keep going until you run out of pins. When we take the pins out, we see our marks. There's a pair of marks. There's a pair of marks. Not to mention that the previous pin lines also serve as a nice wedge guidance from which we could draw from point to point a curved wedge line. Here's the chalk line. Now the question becomes, how do we get this line transferred to the front side of the coat? The answer is to once again trace the line with pins. Once that's done, we need to figure out how to release the lining from the coat so that we can get in. This coat is a very nice coat. The hem is tacked down at the bottom, so we'll have to either open it at the bottom here or at one of these inside seams in order to get at this area. Lots of times coat lining hems are not attached, and then we'd already be inside. But we can go the distance. I'm going to release the center back seam in between both of these seams that we're working on. A ripping we go. Where I've ripped in back here, I will be sewing back up by hand when we're finished, but it gives me access now to this area where we marked with pins so that I can mark with chalk. A little awkward to show here and a little awkward to do, but it does avoid the drawing on the front side of the coat. There's a mark. I'm again feeling for the pins. And where there's hardness, there's a pin. I can make some marks. These marks will be the stitching line for later on. So just feel along. Always referring to where you pinned on the lining, finding your spot and marking. So now you can understand better why someone might choose to draw on the front side of the coat. It's a little easier, but once you get used to doing it this way, then you don't have the drawing on the front of the coat, you have it on the back side of the front of the coat. Also, don't worry if you weren't able to reach in and get around to this side of pins. It's alright as long as you marked this side of pins, because it will all mirror over to the other side. You'll see shortly. Don't worry. At this point, as often happens with alterations, we've now come to a tight spot. We're working on a certain area of an already made garment, so the area space can get tight. But reach inside the lining until you find the marks that you've made. Here they are. Little marks, which are your little stepping stones to your stitching line. Now pin at those marks through both thicknesses. Further working up your pathway to the stitching line. And I've decided I'm actually going to pin from the underside through the little marks, because I want to start from the top shoulder blade and work down through the waist area. It's just the natural way to go with your work off to the left of you when you have the coat underneath the needle. Once again, I'm going to draw lines from pin to pin. If you're more comfortable using a ruler to do so, of course that's what you do. Either that or put more pins in between other pins, just so you know where you're going. Getting that wedge shape identified. We are ready to sew. Starting up at the shoulder blade, you may be surprised that it's hard to get as close to the underarm seam as you'd like. That's because of the thickness and the width of the presser foot back here. That's okay. Just start up as high as you can. Follow your pin lines and your chalk lines. The new stitching line, and we'll get around to ripping out the old stitching line. Go into the lining, and now we want to make that seam. So we'll pin along the new line from the inside. We guesstimate, nope, yes. The idea is to sandwich in the chalk line until you don't see it. Pin along the chalk line, but such that you won't see it when you turn it right side out. Keep at it till you get it, all the way along the chalk line. Getting there. Here's the new lining stitching line, and I've decided I'm going to trim with the pinking shears the lining and probably the coat instead of ripping out the old stitching. Now I'll rip out what little bit of old stitching there is that I didn't trim off. I'll clip the curve a little bit. I could hand sew together the center seam now, except that we're not quite finished. Remember, we abandoned our original way of doing things for the alternative way. So let's go back to how we would finish up from when we're drawing the chalk line on the outside of the coat. Now is a good time to compare seams, don't you think? This is the side that we haven't completed yet, but this is the nice, curved, more fitted seam that we have completed. Makes quite a difference. Here's where we left off on that first seam. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to eyeball the other side's chalk line. And I have the pin lines, the obvious pin lines to follow too. So just trust yourself and draw it on. Much like we did with the other seam's lining, we're going to pin this seam and make those chalk lines disappear into a brand new curved fitted seam. All pinned. And ready to sew. We are on the home stretch now. All we have left is this last lining seam and then the center seam that we'll sew together. So let's get it done. Match up center back seam stitching holes to stitching holes. Sew up by hand. Make sure to only go through the lining and not the coat. We are so close to completion. Hang on. We're finished now, and wouldn't you agree there's some very nice shape to this coat?
Hey superhero, now move on to either one of these videos created especially to help you.